Hello. So, that's been a fun couple of days. It often is. Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 4 of 5 of the Crown Colony class Long Patrol. Now, yes, I do realize there is one of the 1980s videos still to come. That's because I recorded it, thought it was going to be fine, watched it through, and went, no, colors still clashing. And when I say colors clashing, it almost gave me a migraine. So I decided that that's going to be a hell of a bit, which means I'm not, of course, going to get to the questions and the answer to comments to that on that soon, because that will have to come and people have to have time. But it's been a fun few days. And this is about the Ceylon group, and it's also sort of the summary point in the live presentation. And so, it's always fun. We are talking, of course, about the Crown Colony class cruisers, and they're pretty darn cool ships. They really are. But before I get too much into them, I'm going to need a drink. My apologies. I didn't realize my glass had run empty. There we go. So, Crown colonies are kind of fun. The towns are kind of fun. They're in many ways an interesting question about as much about what might have been as what was, because here's the question. If the Royal Navy had got the quadruple turret working for Edinburgh and Belfast, the souped-up towns, would the Crown colonies have been completed with 3 turrets from the get-go, but 3 quadruple turrets, and increased AA armament from the get-go? That's an interesting idea. Also, there's the other option. What would have happened if the Royal Navy had managed to get the 6-inch gun to work as a viable general-purpose AA weapon as well? If they had managed to get the angles up, the rate of fire was sort of already there. If they'd got the angle up and so they could be using 6-inch for long-range AA fire, you then have another scenario going on. What I'm trying to say is, when you're looking at ships being designed and built, there are people who will sit there and go, well, you should never consider the what-ifs because they didn't happen. And they are right in a way, because you fight the war with what you have. But you don't build with what you have. You build with what you think you're going to have going in mind. When you're designing a ship, you design it with the idea of what technology is going to be available in time to get it ready. And also what likely technology is likely going to come on into service in the next 10 years or so. Sorry, I'm not sure where that came from. The trouble is, you don't really know. You don't know. If you'd asked Admiral Henderson in 1932 what 6-inch turrets his ships would have been fielding by 1939, that's the year before he becomes 3rd Sea Lord, and the year he dies. 7 years. Well, he'd been updated. He was being prepped by that point to become 3rd Sea Lord. He probably told you that they were expecting to shortly have a quadruple 6-inch turret. And have that turret be able to fire up to angles of 80 degrees. That was the plan. And honestly, you could see why. They'd already built, at the end of the First World War, after that, an 8-inch double turret, which could get up to 70 degrees and could be used for AA, the first generation of counter-class. We can all imagine anyone's response to seeing an 8-inch shell come at them when they're in an aircraft. It might well be a moment which you suddenly discover you have religion. Or have wet your trousers. Either will work. You probably don't think you're going to be hit by it, because if you are, that's a completely different occurrence. But, you know, just seeing them come at you is probably going to make you consider the meaning of life. Well, imagine that effect if you've got a quadruple 6-inch turrets firing. You have 4 of them. That becomes an interesting thing. At which point you also have to argue, are you still going to be carrying your 4-inch high-angle guns? Maybe. But you might also be carrying a lot of less of those and more 40mm. Alternatively, a crown colony might end up with a 4.5-inch high-angle 4.5-inch gun turret like you have on the battle class in her X position, and a couple of them positioned along midships to provide the equivalent of the 4-inch in its role, in a secondary role on the cruiser, and a whole load of pom-poms. There are all sorts of options for what they might have come across, they might have appeared. The 4.5-inch gun is getting a lot of development. Henderson would have liked it for the tribal class. He'd have liked it for the successors. But it wasn't available. It was supposed to be available. They're pumping in enough funds to try and make it available, but it came up with some metallurgical issues, and it came up with some production issues, and it came up with some... These are all things which happen. So what am I saying? Sometimes when we look at chips, we need to consider the what-ifs as much as the what happens to evaluate the design, to evaluate why they built the design. Because the what-ifs often explain why they chose the design they did. The what happened tells you how effective that design was and how successful their thinking was. They're different things. So, here is HMS Ceylon. She's a pretty ship, and that is HMS Royalist behind her. But she is a pretty ship. She is laid down on 27th of April 1939 by Alexander Stephen and Sons governed, so of course she's going to be a supreme ship. She's built by Alexander. She's launched on the 30th of July 1942 and is commissioned on the 13th of July 1943. She's transferred to the Peruvian Navy in 1960 and will serve first as BAP Colonel Bolognese. In fact, she stays as Coronel Bolognese until she's scrapped in 1985. It's her sister who gets the name change. Her displacement is roughly 8,800 tons in standard and 11,200 tons fully loaded. She's a big ship. Not massive by the times, but she's a powerful ship. After she's completed, and she has 2 months with the home fleet before she's transferred to 4th Cruiser Squadron, operating with the Eastern Fleet, where she takes part in several operations, including Operations Cockpit, Meridian, and Diplomat. Cockpit, of course, being the attack on Sabang, Meridian being an attack on Sumatra, and Diplomat being, well, a training operation is what we'll call it. In November 1944, she transferred to the British Pacific Fleet and was sailed from Trincomalee on the 16th of January, taking part in the raid on Paklan-Braden on the route. By May 1945, though, she was back in the Indian Ocean, taking part in the attacks on the Nicobar Islands, and remained in that theatre until the end of the war. In October 1945, she returns to England for a refit and layup. Post-war, she serves in Portsmouth Command between 1946 and 50, followed by a return to the 5th and the 4th Cruiser Squadrons on the Far East and East Indian stations. Actively engages in the Korean War, carrying out many bombardments, and is eventually paid off again at Portsmouth in October 1954 for reconstitution. And if you just heard a small earthquake, yes, that was my sister coming into our office next door. Her modernisation was largely on similar pattern as Newfoundland and Nigeria. The cost of modernisation of Nigeria, which was sold, and of course was sold to India as Mysore, had been reduced by using sensors and parts originally purchased for the Royal Australian Navy's modernisation of HMS Hobart. But in the case of Ceylon, they simplified it by fitting a new 960 ML Raw to the original tripod main radar mast, rather than fitting a new lattice, and some less comprehensive electrical refitting, and the simplification of fire control ray systems by not fitting the Type 275 flyplane directors using Newfoundland and relying on the new MRS-8 directors supplied and paid for by the US government, similar to that used in the updating of the USN zone cruisers. To control the 4 twin-inch guns with a US Mark 63 radar on the mounts. The new standard twin Mark 5 L60 both on Ceylon had only the simple tachymetric directors, but as I've been over before in our videos, the simple tachymetric directors have something which really does give them an advantage. They are very simple and easy to maintain, which helps. They are a mature technology by this point. After trials with that equipment, she's deployed to Mediterranean, where she provides long-range gunfire support to suppress Egyptian shore battery emplacements at Port Said during the British Army and Royal Marine landings of the Suez Crisis. This is despite, of course, the ruling that the cruisers were not supposed to technically get involved in bombarding. In some areas, it does seem to be that they did get involved, especially in terms of areas which were far enough away from civilian targets that there was less likelihood of a stray shell actually hitting something which was a civilian. Her bombardment was relatively brief, though, as the Egyptian batteries did not return fire. They were quickly taken out. After that, she then serves as an air direction picket, Royalist being withdrawn for political reasons, and Jamaica lacking modern air warning and aircraft direction equipment. Between 1956 and 1959, she served in the Mediterranean Fleet, Home Fleet, and east of Suez. Eventually, she is sold. In December 1959, she returns to Portsmouth and sold to Peru in the same month. It came as a shock to her captain and to many in Britain that only 3 years after modernisation, they were selling off what was considered a very high level and a very high quality cruiser. There were many who suggested that the sale of her and Newfoundland, one of her sisters who I'll be get to later, while the older colony and town cruisers, Gambia, Bermuda, Sheffield, and Belfast, remain in service or reactivate or reserve, probably reflected a good price of sale to Peru and the need for cuts to save the Tiger class, because the Tiger class were really not that well received and not doing that well, but these were the newer ships which theoretically had the longest hull life. If you got rid of them, then you got rid of the threats to people retaining the Tiger class in service or getting rid of them, because, you know, they would retain these ships. Newfoundland and Ceylon were considered a particular threat to them, as they were good hulls and good ships. She's eventually she's deleted from the Peruvian Navy list in 1982 and is towed to Taiwan in August 1985 to be scrapped. But she has a good career with Peru. And then we have Uganda, and later on HMS Quebec, HMCS Quebec. In March 1943, after training at Scapa Flow, Uganda sailed as a convoy escort to Sierra Leone, bound to protect the Sierra Leone-bound convoy from German Narvik-class destroyers operating in the Bay of Biscay. Well, that's more likely 1936As than anything else, but, you know, they do like to, and people do like to call them Narvik class, and I always make sure I mention it in my notes, because if I don't call them Narvik class, there will always be someone that goes, "Oh, you mean Narvik class?" And I'll go, well, actually, no, I would argue the 1936As, barring the mob ones, are not Narvik class destroyers. I would say 1936Bs are the clearest of those ones, but that's a whole different debate. After two of those convoy runs, she escorts RMS Queen Mary, carrying Winston Churchill and his staff across to Washington from the UK. The journey was made at 30 knots the entire way, and the ship sailed into Naval Station Argentia, Newfoundland, very low on fuel, unsurprisingly. Upon return from that duty, Uganda returned to Plymouth for a refit. But that is kind of a long way to have gone at 30 knots. That's unsurprisingly low on fuel, but fairly good. After being refitted, she goes to the Mediterranean to escort the troop convoys heading to Sicily. In July, she joined the 15th Cruiser Squadron Mediterranean Fleet and is part of the force that bombards Operation Husky. It takes part and provides bombardment support for Operation Husky and the invasion of Sicily. She's then assigned to close support for major bombardments throughout Sicily, and, you know, sails a part of support for. Well, she does support Force East mainly, although she does get around a bit and does a lot of blasting away with her 6 inches. Within the British bridgehead, Uganda, along with the cruisers Orion, Mauritius, and the lovely monitor Erebus, primarily supported the British 8th Army, although one of her shells might have gone a little bit of a long way. On 10th of August, in support of the 8th Army again, this time Uganda was supported by the Dutch gunboat Flores. They bombarded positions north of Raposto. And on 12th of August, with the monitor Roberts and Dutch gunboats Scarab and Samiba shelled the east coast of Sicily. On the opening of Operation Avalanche on 9th September 1943, she's part of the fleet bombardment covering the invasion of Italy at Salerno. She's a member of the Northern Attack Force this time, which landed, of course, British 10th Corps. During this attack, Uganda was one of the ships forced to lie inshore to provide direct naval gunfire support. They suffered air attacks from the Germans using FX 1400 radio-controlled and HS 293 glider bombs. While serving off Salerno at 1440 hours on the 13th of September 1943, she took a direct hit from a Fritz X, and it was dropped by a KG-100 bomber. That's a radio-controlled 1.4-ton glide bomb. Ouch! The Fritz X managed to pass through 7 decks and straight through her keel, exploding underwater just under the keel. The concussion for a shock of the Fritz X underwater detonation close to Uganda's hull extinguished all her boiler fires and resulted in 16 men being killed, with Uganda taking on about 1,300 tons of seawater. Damage Control managed to get the ship moving with 1 engine, and she's towed to Malta by USS Narragansett, which is a Naval-class fleet tug, where temporary repairs were made. There was no dry dock in the European theatre that could handle repairs, so she sent to the US shipyard Charleston at South Carolina. She managed to make it across the Atlantic Ocean with only one of her propellers working, and arrives there on the 27th of November 1943. During the repairs, Uganda had her 2 hangars that are designed for submarine walrus and are sort of a vestige of the town class in their design, removed. And the space was used for radio and radar equipment as well as crew amenities. At this time that she gets transferred to Canada, and she does quite well with the Canadians. She has a good crewner who are very quickly promoted after the war, and some of them get very, very high. Her crew are mostly reservists. 87% were RCNVR and RCNR, and the balance were regular members of the Royal Canadian Navy. So this was very much a Canadian ship. Her first assignment was to join the British Pacific Fleet's operational area south of Sakiswangunto. She joined the 4th Cruiser Squadron and spent the rest of the month working up. And had a good time out there. So she gets involved in a lot of operations while she's out there. But to go out there, she did have to go via United Kingdom for some more modifications. And eventually arrived in Fremantle, Australia, on the way to go on 4th of March 1945. As the flagship for the Royal Canadian Navy at this point, Uganda served in the Pacific War, the British Pacific Fleet, and Task Force in 57. On 10th of April 1945, the strike against Sakiswangunto was cancelled and Task Force was ordered to attack Formosa instead. From 11th and 13th of April 1944, Uganda, as part of Task Force 57 in the Pacific, she attacked airfields and installations in northern Formosa, before being redirected back to Sakiswangunto. Ship took part in bombardment of Japanese air bases there and was part of the fleet that was tasked to Leyte Gulf. During a time there, Uganda came under a kamikaze attack. She received battle honours for operations during the Battle of Okinawa and was involved in attacking Truk Formosa as well as Sakiswangunto. At Leyte, she joined the United States 3rd Fleet, and became the only Royal Canadian Navy warship in the Pacific theater to fight against the Imperial Japanese Navy. Later, in May 1945, Task Force 67 sailed from Leyte to Sakiswangunto, and for nearly the entire month, Uganda was among the ships ordered to bombard the island group. Task Force suffered kamikaze attacks, forcing 2 of the aircraft carriers to retire and damaging another. On the 4th of April 1945, the Canadian government changed the manning policy for all ships deployed into the Pacific theatre. All those to the Pacific would have to re-volunteer. Upon volunteering again, the servicemen would be eligible for 30 days leave in Canada before deployment. Controversially, this policy was applied to those already there. And so, the crew of Uganda were polled by the Canadian government on the 7th of May 1945 to determine whether they would volunteer for further duties in the Pacific War. Unfortunately, due to the poor living conditions, lack of a Canadian identity for the ship, which I think is an easy blame. I think that blaming the name is an easy thing for people to point on. I would say I would have to admit that I think it's very easy to blame the name of a ship. I think it's very easy to blame poor living conditions. Lots of ships had cramped living conditions because, as I said, in peacetime, these ships would often go around with 700 crew on board. In wartime, it's 900 and something. It could be more. There is certainly a point made that the crew of Uganda felt they'd volunteered for hostilities only against Nazi Germany and now find themselves fighting a different enemy in quite a different part of the world. But ultimately, I think there is some failures of communication going on here. And it's one of the interesting things is what I find when I read other Canadian officers' accounts of things they've heard about from this operation, what they don't mention as happening, what they don't talk about, what they don't bring up. And whilst, yes, Rollo main guy, captain, later becomes the chief of naval staff, and quite a lot of those officers eventually become flag rank who had been involved in the ship. Unsurprisingly, she was the Canadian flagship. It does mean that there is going to be a sort of curtailment, I think, in some of the evaluations that take place. And the curtailment is this. I wouldn't be surprised if there were a couple of personalities campaigning to go home. There are lots of people who are going to want to go home and not keep being terrorized by kamikazes, and I can understand all that. In fact, I can see that being a very likely thing. I wonder if the officers were doing enough to make the case for why they were there. I have a feeling that they might have felt they could rely on, well, we're at war, we're obviously at war, it's obvious, and we're officers, we shouldn't be campaigning on this. They're thrown into a scenario which they are completely not prepared for. And ships, by their very nature, are very tight communities. A few key personalities are often all you need to make or break a crew, depending on your perspective what this might have been. So I can also see their case and their reason for wanting to go home. Yes, they've got bad accommodation, bad food, all these things. It's cramped, it's tight, it's not nice. And yes, the enemy's changed. But when you listen to a statistic that 605 crew out of 907 refused to volunteer for continuing operating against Japan, that is a tremendous lot. That is 2/3 of the crew. If you consider not manning 2 out of 3 turrets, could knock off 200 of your peacetime requirements of personnel. that's the equivalent of 6 turrets. That's all 3 turrets and all the engineering crew. That's a lot of people. A lot of personnel. And that's a very big skew of the vote. Unsurprisingly, the British Admiralty was a bit furious about this. They often are. And so, the Royal Canadian Navy offers to replace Uganda with HMCS Prince Robert, an anti-aircraft flagship that was being refitted at Vancouver. But the trouble was they'd lost Uganda, which was one of their best anti-aircraft ships, usually one of the best and most up-to-date and best fitted vessels. Anyway, she goes home en route to Canada. Now, after all that, she gets back, and unsurprisingly, Uganda is a bit of a well, it's something which the Canadian Navy would like to forget about. And so in 1947, she is put into reserve. With hopes, everyone hoping, of course, that she wouldn't ever have to be reactivated, that the world will be peaceful and everything will be good and lovely. Unfortunately, the Korean War happens, and so they put her into reactivation. They refit and modernize her at Esquimalt. And in 1952, she is relaunched as HMS Quebec, with everyone focusing in on going, we're giving her a Canadian identity, because that was the problem last time. Now, she then does very well in Korea. She does very well in all the operations she's sent for, and yeah, she lasts till 1960, and then she's sold for scrap. So let's get into this. Why am I saying it's not the name? Lacking the Canadian identity. Okay, so it's a very easy thing to focus on. Her name's Uganda. Of course it lacks Canadian identity. How many Royal Navy ships that fought in Napoleonic Wars and various other wars like that have had French names or Danish names or Dutch names because that's who they've been captured from? It's an easy thing to focus in on the name and blame it on the name, and I'm sure you will find countless historians and countless accounts which will say, yes, they didn't feel they were letting down Canada because she was HMCS Uganda. And therefore it's the British government's fault because they insist on keeping it as Uganda. Because they didn't want Uganda to be upset by them losing the cruiser which was named for them. Well, I'm sorry. But I don't buy that. I don't buy that at all. I buy that as an easy thing to blame it on. I buy that as something which excuses a lot of people involved, both British and Canadian, for failing to ensure that crew was properly, happily, and motivated and properly communicated to. There are many things you learn as a historian. One of them is that whilst keep it simple, stupid, KISS is a good methodology, and often the most simple explanation is the correct explanation. If an explanation looks too simple, and too straightforward, then often it is being used to cover a lot of complex issues. If there are too many people agreeing on something and too many people singing the same hymn, then there is a problem with it as his answer. And I think HMCS Uganda, it's easy to blame it on the name. It's easy to blame it on the name. Now, we could argue, well, if it had been but for want of a different time, maybe they'd have got Newfoundland. And if she'd had the same problem, would they have blamed it on her name? You think of all the Crown Colony class cruisers and all the Town class cruisers. They could have taken any of them other than probably, well, Fiji, which had been sunk, and let's be honest, oh, no. And then you've got Gambia. Well, the New Zealanders never have a problem with the name of her, and they were fighting very hard as her with her as their ship. So why is it the Canadians are so affected by the names of their ships that they cannot get behind it? They can't get behind HMCS Uganda. And then you go, well, you know, perhaps it's just an unlucky name. And that could well be it, but I don't think so. But let's see, would they have been better if they'd been given Newfoundland? Who knows? They could have been given Jamaica, Bermuda, they could have got Gambia, some New Zealand. They could have had Ceylon, Kenya, Trinidad, Mauritius, Nigeria. All these are options. Well, probably not Trinidad, because she'd also been sunk as well, like Fiji had at that point. But basically what I'm saying is it's a leadership thing. And yes, they are good officers, and yes, they go on to very high ranks in the Canadian Navy. But even good officers can be, how do I put it, led astray by their own security. In that they think because they are going to vote one way, they're sure their crew will vote that way, and they're sure they don't want to get involved in it because it's politics and it's messy and it's complicated and it might cause problems in the crew. And they're probably expecting a significant group to vote to go home, but they're not expecting it to be 2/3 to a third. They're suspecting the majority, but they might have to send some crew home. They're thinking they're probably thinking they're going to have to send 100 crew or something home, and the rest will vote say because of their mates. And therefore they don't do anything about it. They don't do campaigning, they don't do any communication with the crew. And especially probably not the captain, because the captain doesn't want to be seen to be pressuring anyone, because that would look bad in the papers. And officers, it would be an abuse of their position. But you could also say, would it have been sensible to maybe have a sit down with officers and senior petty officers, a no ranks discussion, explain the reason they're out there, explain what they're doing, and let the senior chiefs go off and do what they're good at, which is communicating with the crew and making sure the ratings, understanding their role, understanding how important the ship is to the British Pacific Fleet? I don't know. Either way, it doesn't happen. And now Newfoundland, which I know has popped up earlier, but I'll do this one. Yes, you are lucky. She is firing away from you. Well, mainly she's firing away from HMS Rodney, but you know. Newfoundland was laid down on the 9th of November 1939, launched 19th of December 1941, and commissioned the 21st of January 1943. She eventually serves as the Admiralty Grau, and later on the Captain Quinoz for the Peruvians. She's one of the two ships which, as I said, are a bit suspicious that they were sold. She's built by Swan Hunter, and after commissioning, she joins the 10th Cruiser Squadron in the Home Fleet. Early in 1943, she became flagship of the 15th Cruiser Squadron in the Mediterranean. And during the Sicily campaign, she provided support to 1st Parachute Brigade during their securing of Pimisol Bridge. Pimisol Bridge, which links Catania with Syria. On the 23rd of July 1943, she's torpedoed by the Italian submarine Ascini. Some people, sources have, of course, tried to attribute that to a German, but that's because people always presume, submarine worked, it must be German. No, the Italians were very good as well. Oh, caramba, that's been an interesting day. One crewman was killed in this attack, and her rudder was blown off. Temporary repairs were carried out in Malta, and steering on propellers only, and using the assistance of some sails, which she jury-rigged between her funnels, she steamed to Boston Navy Yard for major repairs. So she basically returned to a sort of ironclad era ship of sail and engine power mixture. In 1944, she was recommissioned for service in the Far East. So she is in the other option. She's out there 1943 to 44. Perhaps she could have been picked instead of Uganda for the Canadians, but she wasn't. And she arrives in British Pacific Fleet and takes part in the support of the Australian 6th Division in their Altapi campaign. In July 1945, as part of the BPF task force, she's attached the Japanese naval base at Truk in the Caroline Islands during Operation Inmate. Again, the Royal Navy's tradition, a British tradition of naming operations weirdly continues. And she's eventually part of the British Empire Task Force, which takes control of the naval base at Yokosuka, after being involved in 9th August in the bombardment of the Japanese city of Kameshi. She's then present in Tokyo Bay during the instrument of surrender being signed, and then is assigned to the task of repatriating British Empire prisoners of war. Initially, she's placed in reserve after she returns to Britain in 1946, and then was used as part of the Stokers training establishment, HMS Improves, she went for a 20-month reconstruction at Plymouth in 1951. It was one of the most extensive modernizations provided for the Royal Navy, and it was really very good. And then she became flagship of the 4th Cruiser Squadron in the East Indies. The Captain of Sri Lanka met aboard her during the Hartal of 1953, a countrywide demonstration of civil obedience, and that was basically a safe space for them to go to. It was super interesting. It's one of HMS Ceylon's sisters, but it would have been interesting if it had been HMS Ceylon herself. Anyway, she then underwent a 3-month refit at Singapore before transferring to the Far East and shelling Malayan National Liberation Army targets near Penang in June 1954 while on passage to the Far East. In 1956, October, she sinks the Egyptian frigate Domiat, which was ex-HMS Nith, River-class frigate that served with the Royal Navy in World War II, as it was cruising south of Suez Canal, and, well, Newfoundland ordered it heave to, and Domiat refused and opened fire on the cruiser, causing some damage and casualties, and very brave of the little frigate, but Newfoundland was in company with Diana, which was a daring-class destroyer, and they returned fire, and Well, they rescued 69 survivors from the wreckage. One man from Newfoundland was killed and 5 were wounded during that time. Newfoundland then returned to the Far East until paid off reserve in Portsmouth in June 1959. She sold to the Peruvian Navy in November 1959, and eventually ends up being hulked in 1979, used as a standard training ship, and scrapped later that year. So she has an interesting time. So, there you go. Summary of the class. Well, I did this a proper one and then live one, so instead of doing the proper summary of the class, really, I'm just going to say they were good ships and they're worth studying. But I am going to answer a couple of questions early. I know I've got the part 5 is going to be the official question and answer session. It will be. But I've got a couple of questions that have come in which interest me. Got part 2 of the Fiji to Kenya thing is from Andrew Cox. And he said, from what I recall, King was simply out of his depth in the situation. I seem to recall either ABC or Pound made a comment along the lines of, why have someone adequate when we have excellent people elsewhere? ABC was also not happy that King let a German troop convoy through early on the day, and ultimately his overall performance led to him being sidelined. So do you blame the man for not being up to the situation, or the system that enabled him to get there without spotting he wasn't the world's greatest combat commander? Either way, the sad fact is that in wartime, the price is usually paid in lives. Well, Andrew, A, thank you for the comment. And it's always nice to get some good some interesting comments. B, Admiral King, and this is the British Rear Admiral King, not the American Admiral King. Yeah, you don't get to be a Rear Admiral in the Royal Navy without having gone through a lot of stuff and through having a heavy training. So can I hold him responsible for not doing what his training required of him? Asking the questions when taking command, exactly. Yes, I can. Because even in a war zone, you follow the rule. If you follow, as my good friend Drakenfell often says, and Andrew Lambert says something similar. You have 2 types of naval officers. One who follows the letter of rules, and one who follows the spirit. One who will do exactly what he's told and follow the exact rules, and one who will act outside the rules, but will at least act. King, like a certain French commander who managed to get his force bombarded, didn't do either. He neither followed the rules or acted in spirit, because if he'd acted in spirit and thought about it, we're under heavy air attack, let's take the whole fleet. Because that's the best thing. The letter of the rules is to detach cruisers. That's what he should do. But you only do that after you've checked all their ammunition stocks, which is you're supposed to do. So, if you're following letter of rules, you check the ammunition stocks and then you dispatch the cruisers. They have enough ammunition. If you're following the spirit, well, we're facing heavy enemy opposition. Let's go. And also, I think that convoy, well, I don't think it was German, I think it was Italian. Because most of the convoys which got through were Italian. That he managed to let past. King was out of his depth. But I don't blame the system for him being there. He'd fulfilled the criteria system if he was following the rules of the system, which all the way up he'd professed to do, then he should have been okay. But he didn't. That's on him. That is simply put on him. And this is coming from me, who normally, as you will know from previous videos, doesn't like to blame senior officers for acting when on stuff they don't know in hindsight. As I said, if it's something they couldn't have known without hindsight, there's no point judging them by it, and you shouldn't do it. And you should never judge people by necessarily the standards of today or by the information we have today. They didn't. They don't. In this case, I make a bit of an exception in that, yes, he didn't have the information, but he should have had the information. And even worse, when he did have the information, he then took 40 minutes to make the decision, which was the right decision to make, and therefore he made the right decision. He just took a long time doing it. 30 minutes, 40 minutes, whatever. And that compounded things. So that's the problem. If the moment he'd had the information, he had sent off the order, gone, right, everything, they would have received it at, let's say, 23 minutes past, 5 minutes past. They would have been sailing away for a little over a quarter of an hour. Yes, it might have taken them half an hour to join up with the fleet, but they would have been back with the fleet by the time they were at the same times they were would have been severely under attack, or within range of fleet neutral support, probably. Maybe less than that. So you see, the thing is, he makes the right decision, but he takes a long time about doing it. And he only gets the information that he should have asked for when his subordinate tells him the information. So the subordinate is having to lead up. The subordinate is having to go, excuse me, here is the information you should have asked for on assuming command. They are of the same rank. They are both rear admirals. And again, you go, well, the system, blame the system. Vast majority of rear admirals in the Royal Navy work out fine. Philip Vian goes from being a captain in the Royal Navy at the beginning of World War II to being Admiral of the Fleet not long after World War II. Goes the whole way up in World War II. Does he have time to attend staff college during it? Any advanced leadership courses? No. He gets promoted and sent into the job. Now, you can say he's exceptional, but there are other officers I can point to who have exactly the same experience. Right, next question, and this is on part 1. And this is from Hugh Fisher, and thank you, Hugh, for this comment. Dr. Clark, you're quite harsh on the people wanting a peace conference and arms limitation in the 1930s. Most of those politicians have been alive during the first decade of the 20th century when European powers built up massive arms navies. How had that worked out in stopping World War I? Okay, Hugh. As I put in my little written answer to you, I'm harsh on the people in 1936. I am not that harsh on the people in the 1920s. I understand why they're doing it for the Washington Naval Treaty. And the First London Treaty, I can get behind that because that's an attempt. It's the 1936 treaty I have an issue with. And principally, I have an issue with that rule on producing... Oh, you can build cruisers up to 10,000 tons, but at the moment you can only build them up to 8,000 tons for the next few years. Why? There are many, many things in the 1936 treaty which, A, are holes which allow people to get out of it at the moment's notice if they want to. So that makes it not worth the paper it's written on. But are also at the same time restricting. You can literally drop that treaty at any point the moment you feel threatened. Yet at the same time, it's got very strict requirements for what you're building, theoretically. So it's at the same point realizing the world is incredibly dangerous and getting more dangerous, and restricting things down more than they need to be under the treaty's original rules, the treaty systems. So, yeah. Also, First World War being put down to an arms race, I do understand why some people do that, and I do understand some of the history behind that. But I would say the First World War has far more complicated starting points than an arms race. I wish it was as simple as an arms race. It wasn't. That's the trouble with it, though. That's the trouble with the First World War. And yes. So, I don't expect politicians, when they're making decisions, to know the future. I really don't. There's no point. You cannot judge someone by hindsight and go, well, this happened. They should have known it was coming. You can't judge them by hindsight not knowing something's coming. Spanish flu, the pandemic, World War II, all these things. But if you've got everyone telling you, we reckon there is going to be a war, and whilst we would like a treaty, and they would like a treaty, why are you limiting it quite so tightly? In that you could get a treaty through, but you could have just warmed up again the previous London Treaty and just gone, right, we'll leave that. And the Royal Navy could have kept building town-class cruisers. Keep churning out the same design. Or, there are other options. They wanted more destroyers. They didn't really get more destroyers. There are, therefore, the thing I do think you can charge politicians with is not preparing the capabilities or not ensuring there is enough preparation for the future put in. And this is, again, another thing which I get into politics. And I have to say, this is my political view, okay? So it's backed up a bit by history. But I would argue the first duty of a government, you're talking about the people talk about defense being the first duty of government, all these things. No. They are important, they are critical, and the governments do have to see, should have to see to them. But I would always argue the first duty of a government is to put in the right infrastructure to support what the future brings. In terms of, instead of having a strategy which says, we think we're going to be putting a directive controlled strategy of things like, we're going to put in this industry in this area, and this industry in that area, and this type of housing in that area, just go, right, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure there are good road, there are good rail links, and we're going to let the industries grow what they are, and good telecommunications links, and good things for people. That's what a government needs to do. And it's the same with defense. You cannot predict what the future is going to be. We do know we're going to need ships. You do know you're going to have, if you're going to have to fight a war, you're going to need ships to be as capable as you possibly can do within the treaty limits. Artificially limiting yourself within that treaty is, I don't understand it. Anyway, thank you very much to both Hugh and Andrew for your questions. I wanted to call you Alex there for a second, Andrew. I realized it was wrong. And I hope everyone's enjoyed these videos. Please do like, share, subscribe, possibly join Patreon to make my book habit even more viable. Thank you. Our Discord is always good for a chat. Anyway. And what have we got coming up? We have Lend-Lease Act tomorrow. That's going to be fun. I'm looking forward to Lend-Lease Act. I've been doing a lot of extra research into that today and yesterday. And it's fun. It's interesting. It's probably going to be different than people think I'm doing. Probably people think I'm going to be focusing on the actual ships put in and the ships delivered. But no, I'm more interested in the acts and how they were treated and how what the views are and whether it was as universally positive as people think it might be. Anyway, thank you very much and take care. Have a nice day. Have a nice evening and see you tomorrow for live. And today's date is the 10th of the 3rd, 2021, and tomorrow's is the 11th. So if you're watching this in 2023 on the, I don't know, a Monday, I'm sorry, lives are on Thursdays. Enjoy, take care, and have a nice evening.